Modern times owes a lot to the fact that the Northern Hemisphere has the North Star, also known as Polaris. Ancient navigators could use the North Star as an indication of true north. Although it's not exactly at true north, it's close enough that navigators could develop systems to navigate the globe. There's really nothing quite like it in the Southern Hemisphere. There are stars which can indicate the position of true south, but there really isn't a bright star. And also, the Southern Hemisphere doesn't have the advantage in the north of two constellations, the Little Dipper and the Big Dipper, which point to true north, or point to Polaris, the North Star. The Little Dipper has Polaris at the end of the handle, and the Big Dipper has two stars which point to it. Most of the Earth's landmass is in the Northern Hemisphere, and therefore most of the resources are there too. This is why most of the Earth's population is there. This is a major reason why the most influential civilizations in the past were in the Northern Hemisphere. The context for the information in this video will be presented here. I need to do a quick review on the information which was introduced in the previous video. You see here in yellow the crossroads region between Africa, Asia, and Europe. For thousands of years, this has been a very strategic area. The migration of peoples, movement of armies, and the exchange of ideas was very intense through that general region. It was basically a bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe by land. And of course, there were sea routes in this general area and nearby. All these things were interconnected at that time, and they are today. The empires which contributed the most in the time frame of 5,000 years ago to about 1,700 years ago are labeled here: the Egyptian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, Greek Empire, and Roman Empire. Although there were many civilizations and empires around the globe which contributed in their own unique way to modern times, these are the most influential during that time frame. And they all controlled the crossroads region for long periods of time. Israel was at the center of this for much of that time, and therefore Israel had trade relations with these empires and at times also came into conflict with them. Each one of these empires devastated Israel. The result was that Hebrews, or later to be known as Jews, were scattered throughout these empires like sheep scattered if the shepherd was struck down. In modern times, the Jews, of course, spread through much of the world. And you can see a relationship today between great powers and the Jews, and more on that later. We have here the context of the ancient patterns which led to the New World Order. This map represents the extent of the R male DNA haplogroups, approximately in the time frame of 1,500 to 8,000 years ago. This includes the common trade routes, settlements, civilizations, and reach of these R male DNA haplogroup peoples. Now, the reason why I have this map here is because this particular group of peoples made major contribution eventually to modern times, and I'll get more in depth on that in a moment. Scientists have found archaeological evidence in their digs in this entire area highlighted here of peoples that were depicted as having blue eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes, which are low pigmentation eyes, light complexion, or even in a lot of cases white complexion, particularly in the ruling class of almost every civilization underneath this highlight. Of course, there were also indigenous and native peoples in the ruling classes of those civilizations as well. And over time, in many cases, there was a mixing. And the mixing out resulted in the elimination of white skin and blue eyes in a lot of the ruling class over a period of thousands of years. It was a slow but steady process. However, in ancient times, most people around the world had high birth rates, and they had to have high birth rates because there were so many dangers and so much mortality from things like diseases, accidents, and wars and so forth. Now, the R male DNA haplogroups are still in existence today. It's believed by scientists, after spending a lot of money and time researching it in the laboratory and out in the field, that the R male DNA haplogroups originated in Eurasia, approximately in the area of present-day Ukraine, southern Russia, Caucasus, western China, northern India region. It's debated where exactly it could have originated, but it's almost certain that it was in that general area. When this R male DNA haplogroup arose was either just before the last ice age or glaciation, during it, or soon after it. A haplogroup is a set of genes which are unique to a certain people and mark that particular group in a certain area of the world. Over time, there is a predictable rate of mutations of genes, and as members of this DNA haplogroup people or culture move in different directions, they mutate in different ways, and this can be tracked over time and predictably over time, and also analyzed by present day peoples. It's interesting that today, right now, there are pockets of R male DNA haplogroups all over this area, indicating that this is true based on reality, that these haplogroups spread this far, at least this far, and perhaps even farther. Of course, there's also descendants indicated by mutations almost all over the world, including on the settlement in Antarctica. Anywhere basically that whites went in the world, they carried oftentimes carried this marking, this genetic marking. How this relates to ancient times and modern times is that whites in significant numbers were members of the ruling class of civilizations in this region. It's particularly notable from earlier in this video and in the previous video that the Egyptian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, Greek Empire, and Roman Empire had a strong white ruling class in a lot of generations. Although there were some generations of mixed peoples in their ruling class, there were in several entire dynasties of whites in each of those empires, making huge contributions to them. This is scientifically established. Here we have the female HDNA haplogroup. It is also primarily a European haplogroup. Notice that the most intense concentrations of it in ancient times were centered in Europe. Of course, today, wherever whites go, white women oftentimes carry this HDNA haplogroup, so there are high concentrations of this in the United States, Canada, and other places. Okay, but this represents ancient times, thousands of years ago. Notice how widespread this female DNA haplogroup is, how intense and concentrated it is for thousands of miles outside of Europe. Notice it penetrates deep into Africa even. It is very common in the Middle East and goes as far as India and Southeast Asia and up north, the western half of present-day Russia. It's just a huge DNA haplogroup, just like the R, the male version, is also very huge. Now, there are other haplogroups, genetically speaking, which contributed to the greatest empires of the past, such as J and I and M, some other ones, but these are the biggest and most intense ones in ancient times.
It's the Science Times podcast for Tuesday, December 1st. I'm Jane Bornemeyer, editor of New York Times Radio, sitting in for David Corcoran, who's on vacation. This week, evidence of a highly developed civilization that predates ancient Greece and Rome. New research has broadened archaeologists' understanding of an ancient civilization they're calling Old Europe. It was highly developed and predates even ancient Greece and Rome. The civilization is the subject of a new book and of an exhibition here in New York City. John Noble Wilford has the story, and he's here with me now in our studio. John, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So, John, it seems that before there was ancient Greece and ancient Rome, there was an ancient civilization somewhere in what we now know as Europe that was highly developed. Talk about the characteristics of that civilization.
The archaeologists are calling it Old Europe because it preceded Greece, Rome, and all of the other civilizations that are better known. This one is in the area that is now present-day Bulgaria, Romania, and Moldova, and along the Black Sea, and the lower Danube River Valley, and into the Balkan Hills. So it's a rather expansive area, and the people entered there from Greece. They brought along agriculture, and we're talking about 5,000 BC.
And about how many people?
Well, I don't think they really know, but some of the evidence for some of the towns, there's one site that looks to be about 800 acres and may have had 10,000 people. So these were not inconsequential settlements.
What were some of the characteristics of this civilization?
First of all, they were farmers.
Do you know what they grew?
They brought along barley and wheat seeds. They also brought along domesticated cattle and sheep. So it was a rather elementary farming system. But they became masters of the new technology of their day, which was copper smelting, large-scale copper smelting. There was copper ore in the Balkan Hills, and they developed the techniques for high heat smelting to extract pure copper from the ore. From this, they cast axes and hammered knives and also made ornaments. They also seem to have been involved in long-distance trading with links into the rest of Europe, also into the Eurasian steppes.
John, let me ask you about the copper smelting. I mean, what was the source of heat high enough to melt copper?
They had gradually learned through ceramics how to get high heats, and over time they just started escalating that, and I guess at some point they must have been able to reach several thousand degrees.
Is that surprising that people at that time could achieve that?
Well, it was known that about this time, through parts of Europe as well as the Middle East, that you were beginning to have copper. After the Stone Age, you had a brief Copper Age before you entered the Bronze Age and Iron Age. I think the thing that was distinctive about these people is that they had a large-scale copper industry.
How did this, I guess my question is twofold. I mean, how did this civilization go unknown until now, number one, and how was it discovered?
In terms of modern archaeology, it was unknown until the early 20th century. And even then, all they were finding were some traces of some copper goods. It was known that there were some people there about 6,200 BC. It was known that there were settlements scattered through these three countries, Bulgaria, Romania, and Moldova, related through trade and cultural affinities. But we didn't know that. And then when local archaeologists began finding more and more things and starting to find some graves, by that time these countries were behind the Iron Curtain. They had no contacts with the West. They were not allowed contacts with the West. Therefore, our archaeologists didn't know what their archaeologists were doing. And it just sort of remained that way until in 1972, the Bulgarians discovered at Varna, which is on the Black Sea, they discovered a huge cemetery. They found the first graves, and then through the 70s and the 80s, they kept finding more and more graves. And this is when they discovered that these people were interesting. They were not just simple farmers. They were skilled. They were skilled. The graves at Varna are described as the largest known collections of gold up to that time. And this indicated that this culture wasn't just a very simple egalitarian culture. It had hierarchy.
And what became of this civilization? It died out in some way, or how?
Well, they don't know. They know that by 3500 BC, it became virtually extinct as a really cohesive culture. It was sort of declining for about 500 years before that. One of the most interesting hypotheses is that people from the steppes of Russia and Ukraine, once they developed horseback riding, they sort of rode in and took over.
Right. My last question for you, John. There's an exhibit of some of the artifacts from this era.
Yes, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, which is an institute of New York University. The exhibit is there on East 84th Street. It's two large galleries. There are about 250 artifacts, some of the gold from the graves at Varna, a lot of figurines, clay figurines of mostly women. They had a passion for forming small miniature clay women. This culture was quite advanced in visual language. That is, they had a lot of large, decorated, multicolored pots, pans. Some of them seemed to be involved in rather decorative, sort of in-home dining rituals.
Sounds wonderful. I'm going to go see it.
All right.
John Noble Wilford, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The North Star always guides me when winter skies are gray, and I wait for the sun when all are one. I shall not betray, calling at me